Hello and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, you should be subscribing already. So what are we talking about today? I wanted to basically have on my channel the traditional video of fall/Halloween recommendations, so that's what I'm going to be doing, and I've kind of divided it up between like classics and more modern books, so I'm just gonna get straight into it. So the first book that I want to talk about is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. So what is this book about? Before I talk about that, I just want to give you some kind of basic interesting facts about this book. It was published in 1818, but the version that I have here is the 1831 text. So in that 20-year period, a lot of things happened in Mary Shelley's life, including the loss of several children, the loss of her husband, and she definitely has been affected by these losses. When she goes back and alters the text, it is a more harrowing read, I believe. I haven't read the original text, but I think that I would prefer this one anyway. And this is a book that fuses Gothic fiction with the also prevailing romantic sentiments of the time. It's very inspired by the kind of works that her mother wrote. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who is most known for being kind of like a pioneering feminist, but also had a lot to do with the Romantic movement and the kind of focus that that movement had on like nature and all of that kind of stuff. I can't think of a word for it. So the basic plot of this book, if you've somehow missed it, I'm not going to go into it too much because I talked about it in my previous video, but basically Victor Frankenstein, young male scientist, decides that he wants to try to create life where there isn't. So he basically goes and scavenges bodies and puts together this very odd-looking man, and then he reanimates him through science, which is basically, this was the birth of science fiction. You heard that right. A teenage girl invented science fiction. We should all take a moment to commemorate her. The second that this life comes into being, Victor Frankenstein is like, oh, I'm bowing out, this is creepy, and I've made a huge mistake. So he just abandons the monster, who then is left on his own to figure out what life is all about. And there is this kind of like cat and mouse situation that happens. This book is a lot less linear, I think, than people expect it to be. It uses a lot of devices that were traditional of the time, such as like letters and diary entries and things like that. And it's mainly a story told to other people. So, you know, there's the captain at the beginning telling the story to his sister. The monster is telling the story to... No, wait, does the monster... Yeah, the monster is telling his story to Victor Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein tells the story to the captain, like that kind of thing. The reason why I think that you should read this book is it's always good to go to the originator of a genre. So I personally don't like science fiction that much. For me, this book is more interesting and compelling for the gothic and romantic elements that are in it. And I mean, think about how many works have been inspired by Frankenstein. It really does change your perception of it to have read the original work. Furthermore, for me, the story is a lot more about what it means to create life and to distance yourself from it, even though it is your responsibility. So a lot of this book is kind of commentary on parents, particularly male parents, who abandon their children or just leave their children's upbringing to other people. So I've talked about this before, but if you're going to read this, read it with Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, because it gives you so much insight into what Shelley was thinking and also why she goes back and edits the text. Because I know some people probably prefer the 1818 text, but for me, I Love a Woman Scorned and the 1831 text with its more critical view of Victor Frankenstein and its more humane monster is right up my alley. So that's Frankenstein for you. The next oldest book on my list it's The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. You can barely see the text on this weird edition. And this book was published between 1901 and 1902. The Sherlock Holmes stories were usually serialized in a publication called The Strand. I think that by this point, Arthur Conan Doyle was thoroughly sick of this character and had killed him off, but brought him back again for this story. And what's so cool about the story is that it kind of fuses, you know, what by that point were kind of dated story techniques like, you know, letters and paper clippings and stuff like that. And it fuses this kind of like gothic type tale with the sort of modern Sherlock Holmes detective reasoning kind of narrative. And that's what I really like about this book. You are in it and you... Okay, I haven't even talked about the plot. So the plot of this book is basically Sherlock and Watson are sat doing their thing in their apartment, and this young man from America, Henry Baskerville, comes to Sherlock Holmes basically asking for help because he has inherited this old-ass mansion and it's supposed to be haunted by this hound that has recently killed off his ancestor, Sir Charles Baskerville. So they are obviously on the trail, and it is just, it's set in the kind of like foggy moors and creepy surroundings, and most of it is Watson on his own trying to figure out what's happening and kind of being abandoned by Sherlock. And I'm not going to go too much into it, even though it's an old story and you should know how it ends. I just love this one. I think this is my favorite and probably the only Sherlock Holmes story that I'm really going to revisit, because I love that kind of fusion between there's something mysterious afoot, but actually there's an easy explanation for it. Basically, I think, you know, it stems from my love of Scooby-Doo. But anyway, what I was going to say about this is that... What was I going to say about this? This book is barely 200 pages. It is such a quick read, and I think it's a great example of the dynamic between Watson and Holmes. It really shows Holmes for, like, how much of a douche he is. This is another classic and just a great pick for this time of year when everything, especially where I'm living, England, where this is set, everything is foggy and damp and cold and dark. It's like you're in it. Who doesn't love a story about haunted rich people who are being killed off one by some supernatural dog? I love it. So the next oldest book on my list, I have written down shit. I know. Who is she? The next book that I want to talk about is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I want to do a disclaimer before I start talking about this. I would not have been able to get through this book without the audiobook. I found it really slow going, and it really is, and I found all of the characters extremely irritating, particularly the main character. So this is a story about a young girl, and we are told it from her perspective. She is just your basic bitch, okay? And that's basically is how she is described. She is gullible, she is young, and she is very easily impressed by her love interest, Maximilian de Winter, who is a man like 20 years her senior. He is super wealthy. He is an asshole. Like, when I entered this book, I thought that it was a romance, and I was just so confused. I was like, there is nothing romantic about this relationship. He keeps calling her, like, little idiot, little fool, what do you know? He's just awful to her. Anyway, she is whisked away by him to Manderley, which is the estate that he owns. And when she arrives in Manderley, she realizes that there is something kind of not right. So Max's previous wife, Rebecca, dies under mysterious circumstances, and her, not maid, I can't remember what it's called when you are the sort of woman in charge of a large estate, but that person, Mrs. Danvers, is hostile towards this unnamed narrator and talks about Rebecca constantly. As the story goes on, we watch the main character continue to mess up, and the consequences of that, and all the kind of odd, creepy events. We watch the main character kind of mumble along and mess up constantly, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that nobody really communicates to her, and she is too timid to ask for what she wants, in direct contrast to Rebecca. Now, I won't tell you how this ends, but when I got to the ending, I was like, oh, okay, alright. What I find cool about this is when I started looking up Daphne du Maurier and learning a little bit about her history. So she had a house that she was very much in love with that I think she had to give up due to her financial circumstances. She had a very philandering husband who I think made her feel quite shitty. She was also, I think, what you would kind of describe as a little bit of a tomboy. And from what I've read, she was most probably bisexual. And so this book is tinged with kind of lesbianic elements that I think are super cool. Like, Mrs. Danvers is clearly obsessed with Rebecca, and also just the way that Rebecca is talked about is very as you would about a woman that you're obsessed with. So I thought all of those elements were really interesting. I also think it's interesting, this book is a take on Jane Eyre, so you will recognize a lot of the same tropes and devices used in Jane Eyre, and you will also recognize a lot of the same characters, you know, Jane being this kind of basic girl, but the difference being that Jane is a lot more headstrong than the main character in this book. And then you have the Mr. Rochester, who is just a weird guy, being Maximilian de Winter, and then Rebecca, I suppose, being the woman in the attic. So yeah, I think what makes this book interesting is when you actually finish it, what it leaves you with, all of the kind of psychological elements to it. Yeah, everybody has a different interpretation of this book. To me, Max de Winter is an asshole, and he is the villain of this story. And, you know, I kind of root for Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, but anyway, you will learn all about that if you actually pick this book up. And like I say, definitely try the audiobook if you find it a little too slow going. I have not seen the Armie Hammer film. I don't intend to. But any version that makes Max de Winter seem more likable, I am immediately skeptical of, especially if it's been done by a man. I'm not interested in that. What I like about this book is that a woman who experienced a lot of shit due to her husband sits down and writes about basically what it is like to live with a shady spouse. Anyways, I won't say any more. Definitely check it out. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now, another disclaimer here. I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of this book. And I think part of the problem with books like this and the other ones that I've mentioned is that they become such intrinsic parts of pop culture and culture at large that you have such massive expectations for them that when you actually sit down to read them, they just can't live up to it. So when you have a book like this and it says, as nearly perfect a haunted house tale as I have ever read, and the person who has said that is Stephen King, you have certain expectations about how freaky it's going to be. I mean, Stephen King has said that this is his most perfect haunted house tale. I mean, there's even another quote by Stephen King. They really go in on the Stephen King. Stepping into Hill House is like stepping into the mind of a madman. It isn't long before you weird yourself out. Okay, so what is this about? We have this woman called Eleanor who clearly isn't really doing very well in her own life. She volunteers to join this kind of psychic experiment at this so-called haunted house called Hill House, and she's supposed to like stay there for about, I think, a summer, and it's her and 3 other characters. Basically, they are joining Dr. Montague, who wants to prove once and for all whether hauntings happen and whether Hill House itself is haunted. So for me, this book was not very creepy at all. It wasn't scary, and I think, as I say, part of the problem is that when you read this from the perspective of somebody reading it in, say, 2020, you know, our bar for what's scary is massively different to what somebody who would have read this in the 1950s would have expected from a scary story. So for that reason, it's kind of difficult to be scared by it. When you read this from the perspective of somebody like Eleanor, who is extremely lonely, extremely susceptible, and wants to find some kind of excitement in her life, I think this book is a lot more interesting. And I would definitely recommend that you check out the Netflix show Haunting of Hill House, because I think it takes what is in this story, the idea of like we are haunted ourselves. It is not the houses that are haunted. It is us. We all have emotional baggage, and it manifests one way in our childhood, and it kind of comes back in our later adult life to truly be almost more scary than when we were kids, because when we are kids, we kind of believe in the magic of the situation. When we're older, we are trying to rationalize it, and when we can't, I think, especially because the author of this book, Shirley Jackson, is known to have been struggling with mental health herself, and a very agoraphobic person who distrusted people. I just think when you take elements like that into the reading of the book, it makes it 1,000 times more interesting. And like I say, don't read this because you want to get scared, because I don't think that's going to work. But if you want to read a kind of psychologically scary book, and also the mother of this type of book, then definitely go for it. And on the subject of Stephen King, for some reason I don't own copies of these books, but if I were to recommend what are 2 of the scariest Stephen King books, in my opinion, I would say The Shining and Pet Sematary. Those are definitely the best books to read at this time of year, especially Pet Sematary. It gives you all the creepy feels. When I was reading that, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, the baby, oh my god, no, that fucked me up. This concludes the classics part of my book recommendations video, and I'm gonna take my glasses off because now I don't need to look like an intellectual. So the books that I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to try to go through quickly, because I don't know about you guys, I'm really struggling with like dry sinuses and all kinds of crap. Sexy. And so yeah, I can't be talking for too long, so let me get into these books quickly. I would recommend The Golem and the Genie by Helen Wecker? This is a story set in New York in the 1900s. It really is kind of a tale about immigration and what it's like in cities like New York, where you have these vastly different cultures kind of clashing and meeting. So the golem represents sort of the Jewish side, and the genie represents the more Arabic side of things. So these are actual characters in this story. They meet up and kind of together try to navigate life in this unknowable city. They have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. So this is, I guess, what you would kind of call fantasy, light fantasy. It is very atmospheric. It is an extremely quick read. It's about 650 pages, but it's really quick to read, and the text is quite large. The font is weird, but that's another issue. This book is about these two... This book is about these two characters, and together they are firstly trying to navigate life in what to them is kind of an unknowable city. And you have the golem, who represents kind of naivete and also paranoia. She is only recently made, and then you have the genie, who's like thousands of years old, so he is kind of like larger than life and really full of himself and thinks that he knows everything. So you have these two personalities kind of clashing and coming together, and at the same time they're also trying to work against this evil force that they don't really know what it is, but it's definitely bad. So we are following kind of multiple perspectives in this book, including the golem and the genie and this evil force and lots of other people. We are kind of going back and forth in time, you know. There is some romance, there is monsters, you know, we got all that shit going on. I really like this book, you know, it mixes fantasy and historical fiction, and you know I like that. So I would definitely recommend this for a fall-time read, and I really don't have that much more to say about it. It's good. So the next book that I want to talk about is another historical fiction. I shock myself. And that is His Bloody Project by Graham McCrae Burnett. So this book is written as a true story, but it's not. It's basically written as documents relating to the case of Roderick McCrae, a novel edited and introduced by Graham McCrae Burnett. And you've got a preface in which the author is talking about finding these documents and putting them together into a narrative. So we are following, I think they are peat farmers in Scotland in the mid 1800s, 1869 it says. And we know that this young boy, Roderick McCrae, has killed 3 people quite brutally. So we follow his narrative, and at the same time it's interspersed with interviews and court documents and that kind of stuff, and then we arrive at the trial itself. So this is a very quick read, and once again you can see a kind of common theme in the books that I've selected. This book deals with mental illness and unreliable narration. It really makes you question what happened, who do I believe? I think it's so interesting because Roderick is a really sympathetic character, but what he's accused of is awful. It's truly disgusting, heinous. I just think it's skillfully done in terms of making you sympathize with the character, but then also really questioning your sympathies and why you feel the way you do. I had some issues with this novel. I think that it could have been a little bit longer and that kind of shebang, but generally I think it's a good, atmospheric, creepy read for this time of year, and I really love stories with unreliable narrators and mental illness being discussed because, hey, there's a lot of that in the world, if you haven't noticed. Definitely a good one for this time of year, and you know me, I love historical fiction. I love when it's talking about mental illness. I love when it's got unreliable narrators, and I love it when they're poor. That's like tick, 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 tick for me. So the next book that I want to talk about is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. Another disclaimer here, this wasn't necessarily my favorite book, but I liked a lot of elements about it. So this is a story about a young woman who is, once again, clearly suffering from some sort of mental illness, and she is contacted by this aging author who is famous for writing these stories, but her 13th tale is kind of hidden, missing. I don't know, it's been a while since I read it. Anyway, come on, you can do it. Bear with. Come on. We have a visitor. Now, will you sit still? So she is contacted by this older author to come and write her biography. So it is a creepy tale of this house, of these people who lived in this house. A lot of shady things going on. There's kind of a mystery involved. And obviously it all comes together in the end. And it's one of those stories where you're like, oh my god, thank god I don't have any of that going on in my life. It's pretty grim in places, but I really liked it. I think it's basically a classic. Stanley. I think it's basically a classic book for this time of year. I think most people would get a lot out of it, and I think it kind of plays. This is growing great. I think it kind of plays on. Stanley, just sit. I think it kind of plays on a lot of the tropes that Haunting of Hill House introduces into the genre. I don't really have that much more to say about this, but I do think that this is a good story for this time, and a lot of people seem to like it a lot. I liked it. Not a lot, but I liked it, and I think it's worth checking out. Now, the last book that I'm going to talk about is a non-fiction book, and that is Dead Mountain, The Untold True Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident by Donnie Eicher? So the Dyatlov Pass incident is basically a very famous kind of unsolved mystery, and the mystery is in principle about a number of young Russians were found in the Ural Mountains, and they were found in the Ural Mountains under mysterious circumstances. They had, taken their clothes off, and their eyes were missing, and they were all spread across this vast but completely deserted area. And it led to a lot of speculation about experimentation, about UFOs, about just all sorts of things. So Donnie Eicher goes on this mission to find out what actually happened to these kids. Why is there so much speculation around what happened to them, and can we actually ever know the answer? So he himself embarks on this journey, and there's something about the story that I find really creepy, and especially the pictures of the dead bodies. It's unsettling, and really at the end of the day, mystery or not, the way that they died is incredibly grim and creepy in itself. You have like 8 young people in their early 20s who die in fairly horrific circumstances all alone in the Ural Mountains. So yeah, it is just a really depressing story. But I do think that Eicher's argument and theory for what happened to them seems infinitely plausible and very interesting. And I think what I like most about this book, apart from all of that, is I think it's just a very nuanced, a very sympathetic, and a very respectful take. I think that I am very skeptical of a lot of true crime, and this kind of falls under true crime, even though there was no crime committed, because it just feels very sensationalist. It feels like it's just kind of taking advantage of really grim and sad circumstances to make a book, and I don't like it. But this book, I think, is infinitely sympathetic towards the victims of this accident, even though I personally, as I've talked about before, would never do anything like this in my life. And, you know, it includes these pictures of the victims, and I often found myself going back to these pictures and just looking at their faces and thinking about what happened to them. You have Yuri Yudin, who is this man over here, and he got, I think, about halfway, and then he had an injury, so he had to turn back, and he is a person that Donnie Eicher speaks to a lot in his research for this story. And I just think it's really interesting how, even though it's been about 60 years since it happened, how it haunts these people still, and how little has changed in some aspects in terms of life in the former Soviet Union. And I also was like, because at some point, Donnie Eicher, like I say, he goes on the same journey as they did and stays in the same area as they did when they died. And I'm just like, some people do things that I just don't understand. But he talks about that as well, like the compulsion that leads him to do this, and has, you know, is fairly honest about the fact that it's kind of a selfish thing to do, because I think his wife is pregnant at the time. I hope you can't hear my stomach rumbling. I think his wife is pregnant at the time that he does all of this, and like, if that was my husband, I mean, okay. But anyway, like I say, it's good reading for this time of year. Perhaps better for winter, but you know what? It's good for any time of year. Read it. It's really good. It's really interesting. And it's a fairly short nonfiction book for those of you who are scared of pages in a book. So yeah, that's what I had to talk about today. I hope that you found some of those worth checking out. If you have read any of those books, if you have any comments at all, just leave one, please, because it makes my video get more interaction. You know the drill. Anyway, thanks for watching, stay interested, and I will see you again at some point in the not so near future. Bye!